I'm Julia Holthouser Richards. Taught at Elkin High School for 23 years and enjoyed it enormously.
When did you first come to Elkin?
We came to Elkin in 1962 so that the first graduating class that I taught was 63.
Okay. Had you taught before, obviously somewhere before you came?
We moved here from Tryon, North Carolina, and I had done some substitute work, but not taught regularly until the last 2 years before I came. I came to see Mr. Carpenter in his office. He was cleaning out his aquarium. I was very struck with this. This was in the middle of the winter. Anyway, he did have a place for me at Elkin High School. It was quite convenient for me and I think for the school. I don't remember the person that I replaced, but when I talked with him in February, he knew that he had a vacancy.
What was your first impression when you first walked in the door the first year and all the students in Elkin?
Terror. I had an unbelievable schedule, which later was changed because that was a big class that year. For reasons that I don't recall, the enrollment was greater than sometimes. And before Thanksgiving, they got another teacher from the state. But altogether, I had 6 different classes. I had an 8th grade English class, and I had the senior journalism class, and the other classes were other years. I knew the names of 2 people who were my sons. Actually, it was somewhat intimidating, particularly the journalism about which I knew nothing. But I didn't have time to worry too much about it, and I was younger in those days, and I was excited about being here and having a new job and that kind of thing.
So when you started to settle in, about mid-year, then how did you start to feel?
I was struck, I was saying to somebody just a minute ago, I was struck with the quality of students at Elkin High School. Of course, Tryon School was a whole different kind of place, and that's really the only other place I had ever taught. I didn't teach for a number of years when my children were young, but it seemed to me that these were high school folks that were going to be fun to teach, and there were certainly a good many people who were capable and interested. The other thing I suppose that was significant was we were a small school, of course, but we were trying to do everything that was being done at any city high school. We had all of the organizations, plus some I expect that have gone by the wayside by now, the sports, the everything. And that made a heavy load for teachers. The first teachers' meeting, we were being allocated extracurricular duties. I don't know whether I hurt somebody's feelings to say this, but the worst job was sponsoring the JV cheerleaders. The JV cheerleaders were the low end of the totem pole, and I didn't have to have the JV cheerleaders. But it was a school that expected you to give a good bit of extra time, I will say. Though I imagine that in public schools all over the country that was more true these days than it is now. I don't know. But you there during the day, and then you came to things in the evening, and you went to the ball games, and you did. And that part of it I really did enjoy.
One of the things about Elkin that lots of people talk about when we sit down and talk is the parents' participation in the school system.
I've always thought, Danny, that Elkin is a town that cared about its children from beginning to end, and a wonderful place to be. If I were going to talk about that to all of you folks who are going to come today, I would say that. I would say, years ago, do we have time for this? You may want to cut this. Mrs. Raymond Harris came to one of my history classes to talk about the history of Elkin. I'm not sure that you knew who she was, but she lived down on, she was born and lived her whole life in one of those big old Victorian houses on Surrey Avenue. I think Mike Neve's house maybe. So she knew more about Elkin than anybody I knew. I loved her, and she was a wonderful person. And said to these students, I don't make speeches, and when I was invited to come, I thought I wouldn't come. But then I thought, Elkin is such a good place to live, and I know some of the people and some of the reasons that it is, and maybe I should go over and tell these high school people what I know and why this is a good town, because sometimes they're going to be responsible. Yes, isn't that lovely?
That is.
And I think that's true. I think Elkin has been a good place to live, and it certainly was a good place for children and teenagers to be, I thought, for our own children.
Right. And you had two boys that played football, and I know you went through what all the parents go through about.
Well, my husband had gone to college originally on a football scholarship, so there wasn't a question about football in my family. And they had been, even in Tryon, they had a JV football team, though I'm not sure how much participation there was there. But the sports, my family was already sort of interested in sports. And other things as well. My oldest son, Karsten, who's your class, had a lot of interests, and he was already somebody that liked to participate in things, and he was interested in debate and other things as well. And that was one of the good things. There was a breadth of activities for people. Everybody can't be a football star and don't need to be.
Right.
But I thought that was true.
I had a conversation with Rick Calloway.
Well, I'm not sure that I remember that particular conversation, though I do remember in the later years of my teaching, this came up again, and it was a question of legislative action that's going to be taken. And there were, in fact, it might even have been the year after I retired, because 2 or 3 people who were influential in the community came over to my house, and we had a conversation. The difference was that we were afraid, I think in a nutshell, that we would be swallowed up by the county system. There's not a thing wrong with the county system, of course, but it serves a different constituency. And over the many years, I think going back to the 1940s, Elkin had already had a few distinctive kinds of things. One of them you may or may not remember, students probably didn't care, but we had parent conferences, and by, as I recall, special legislation, we had half-day off 3 times a year or 4 times a year so parents could come to special conferences, and that was not what other schools were given, because people in Elkin thought that was an important thing and wanted to have it done, and it did help to create, I think, that atmosphere of support by parents that you're talking about. And it just seemed, even though there are certainly disadvantages to a school system the size of Elkin's, I know, and I think at that time Elkin might have had the smallest, second smallest school system in the state. I'm not sure. Tryon, I think, had the smallest. But we felt that we would, of necessity, our curriculum, our pattern of expectation, maybe even one of the things people talked about were the arts, would simply have to be folded into what a county school system would be. Their priorities, by the nature of their constituency, might be different, and we wouldn't have, there would be no way that we could control that in the way we do now. You know, I expect that we had a special district tax, which Surrey County did not have, and that provided for some extras, if you think of them as extras, like music, and we didn't do anything at that time with art that I recall. But that was the point. was simply a sense that the town of Elkin had a little bit different expectations than perhaps a larger, more broad and rural school system would have. Not that, I don't mean to sound critical in any way of the county school system. They have needs to meet, of course, and I imagine are doing a very good job. I don't really know.
The 1960s, and that's the group that's back here. As you say, your first graduating class was 63. So, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but then again, I probably do. You think back on that group of students from 63 through 1970, and that's a very narrow slice of a third of the time that you were here in total. But as you look back on that group, are there certain people that sort of stand out in your mind, either because they were turned out in life to be much bigger than you thought, or were there people that you just knew from the beginning?
Well, memory for somebody my age particularly is very tricky, and it's interesting. As I looked through, I have yearbooks from all the years that I taught. No, not all the years I taught, but all the years I sponsored the yearbook. And they're 10, and it's the period that we're talking about. I remember the earlier years in some ways better than I remember the later years. But comparison is very difficult. You can cut this, but I'll tell you that John Holthouser said to me that in case you ask me who was the second best student I had ever taught, that he was interested to know who I would say. And he said, of course I know you would say I was the best. But anyway, I wasn't actually going to say that. And I don't think you can compare, but there were, I really, as a teacher, and I'm basically just a teacher, there is something fascinating, or ought to be, and challenging in every student you teach, and I don't think there's any way. Some people come to you with scholarly gifts, perhaps, and they are the people who make the top grades, and they are going to go to selective university somewhere and probably turn out maybe to be an academic person themselves, and that's a wonderful kind of person to teach. There are other students who are good students and work hard and have a good record academically, but who are also people that are influential among other students and who sort of set the standards, not for scholarship perhaps, but for good things, that so that you'd have to say this is a wonderful student who has given a lot to the school, and you can't compare that, just those two people. And then, you know, there's that creative person that does everything differently and is not going to follow the rules and follow the pattern, because by very nature they're just not that kind of person. But they have a lot to give. There's not any way I know how to compare those people. One of the blessings in a little school is you know these students. And many times by the time I got through, I knew their parents, and I had taught their parents, so I knew a good bit more about them maybe than most people would, and that helps a lot.
And of course we lost Miss Carpenter, and we've lost Lois Grissom and John Charles and those people. Tell a little bit about the influence that you think that Skinny Carpenter
Well,
had.
and somebody I'd like to add to your list, Danny, is Mr. Eldridge. He was one of the, I don't know how long he taught here, but maybe almost longer than anybody than Miss Emma Cook. I can tell you an Eldridge story that you may relate to. The first year we were here, you would have been, and Carson would have been maybe in the 10th grade, and you were going to play somebody over the mountain somewhere, I don't know. You had to go and take food. Do you have a recollection of this?
We used to do that.
And my husband was out of town, so I was the chauffeur. You left right after school, I think, on the bus, And I believe that they used a dry cleaning van to haul chairs and pots of soup or whatever it was. At any rate, I went down about 10:30 or 11 o'clock to the gym to wait for the bus to come back to take my child home. And the bus hadn't come. But pretty soon, here came the dry cleaning van. And Claude Eldridge, whom I barely knew, got out and he began to take the chairs out and stack them up and do all these things. And he seemed to have finished that and got back in the van and sat there. And he sat in his van and I sat in my car. Finally, the bus came. And when my child got out, I could go home. He was waiting with me. He didn't say a word to me about it, but he just wasn't going to go away and leave me sitting down there in the car by myself. He was one of the most generous persons in he was the same way with students. He dealt with the vocational program, and so often he dealt with students who had much less expectation and much less confidence, and probably for that reason not as interested in giving their best to what they were doing. But he was somebody that cared about everybody he taught. And I think the same thing was true of Royce Grissom. Of course, John Charles worked largely with the sports people. But it was the personal kind of attention that you can give in a little school, and that when you know people, you fit the way you approach them to the person. And I felt that we did a pretty good job of that. What I remember best about Mr. Carpenter was, and this was a good thing, he really cared. I remember a lot of things about Mr. Carpenter. He took his administrative style was hands-on pretty much. And he took an interest in a lot of things that most superintendents in a bigger system don't really have time for. But one of them was graduation. And you may not remember, but he came over before graduation personally and supervised rehearsal for graduation all the time, especially after we had the auditorium. His philosophy was, we had long, formal graduations. After everybody else was waving things in the air and cheering and so on, we didn't do that at Elkin, as you may recall, because Mr. Carpenter's take was, this was a very significant experience, and there were people in Elkin who perhaps were the first people in their family to graduate from high school. And therefore, one of the things was, nobody else should be on the stage when a student walked across the stage. You waited over here till that next person to you got all the way across, and then the next person came behind. Everybody was going to have his moment in the sun on that stage if it took all night. And sometimes I think we thought maybe it was going to, but that tells you a lot about Mr. Carpenter and how he understood the people that we had there, everybody. The people for whom it wasn't a great big deal and the people for whom it might have been a great big deal, with Grandma there and, everybody else.
I want to thank you again for doing this. I got one more question before we let you out of the light here.
Okay.
Memories. But one of your best memories of that first few years that you were here, and one of those aha moments?
Well, that's a hard one. I think that I and most of the teachers were pretty immersed in what was happening at Elkin High School, so that what was a joyful time for students was a joyful time for us. Of course, the football successes were great. More personally, and this probably would have been later, this would be true for any teacher, you would get the same response, I think, would be something that was just, as I say, more personal. You would get a note from somebody who had gone away to college, or somebody would come back and come by your room and say, I remember when you taught me this, or when you required me to do this and I didn't want to do it, and it was a good thing and I appreciated what you did. You know, of course, that's Judy Transu said to me one time, I had a letter from somebody and it said I'd heard from this person and he was doing well and maybe better than we might have expected. She said, Ms. Holt, that's the reason we stay in the business. And of course it is the reason we stay in the business. And I have been very fortunate and appreciated that Elkin students on the whole have been appreciative people. And again, I put it down to the fact that this was a very personal, there were people I taught, not too many of these, but I'm sure they were glad to say, but I may have taught some people 4 years. You know, I taught them in the 9th grade, and the 10th grade, and the 11th grade, and the 12th grade. And so you knew people, and they knew you. And teaching is a people business. It's really not about all that wonderful preparation you had in your university, but it's about people. And I think, I just don't know that I can pick any particular experience that I thought was the very best experience, but I hope students felt this. I thought on the whole we had a happy experience, which is not to say that you didn't have people who were totally miserable and threatened to jump in the creek or something, but on the whole, even when students complain and that kind of thing, I think they thought it was pretty good to go to high school. Great.
And we've got a lot of people that said, I'm going to be there, but I'm like a lot of people procrastinating. Their check's not here, but they're going to pay tonight. And a lot of folks said, are the teachers going to be there? And guess whose name came up more often than anybody that says Miss Holthouser's going to be there. So your shot to say hello back to these people. We're going to do a video, major movie. We'll splice all this together. So part of that video is obviously going to be this interview that we've had to you. So you get to say whatever you want to say.
Well, I would like to say thank you to all those people who made my Elkin experience. Of course, I want to say thank you to you and Lestine and everybody that's helped to do this big deal. And I know that it's been a lot of work, and it's a gift to many people, including me. And I would like to say thank you to these folks and tell them, and I look forward to having some conversation with folks with whom I have not had any contact for a long time, but I have confidence that these are people that have, colloquially speaking, done us proud. I know we have some folks who have had something going on in their lives that have attracted some good attention to themselves and to Elkin, and I'm certainly proud of those folks. I'm also proud of folks that have gotten out of school and grown up and established families and been dependable, hardworking people of independence and initiative and integrity, and made this town, if they're here or wherever they are, a better place to live. And I think that probably goes for most of the people that I taught. And that's a really, really good feeling.
I want to recognize a couple of really special people and we tried to get more, but who we got I thought was really people we wanted to have here, and we're so happy. And I'm going to punch the video in a minute, but I want to tell you I had a great interview at about 5:30 with a lady that was here and meant so much to so many people in this room. Ms. Holthouser is sitting right there. Thank you. And that was well deserved.